When I look back in this moment in time, I want to be able to tell my daughter, who I'm currently holding in my arms, that I did the right thing and that I voted on the right side of history.
Seattle City Council President Lorena Gonzalez talking about her vote to override the veto of Mayor Jenny Durkin on the council's rebalanced 2020 budget. That battle now turning to next year's budget, which we'll discuss in a moment. Welcome, everybody, to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, the podcast that eats 3-hour city council meetings for breakfast, then has a funny feeling in its stomach for the rest of the day. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. I'm also a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. Joining me, he enjoys court hearings, warm baked goods, and long walks on the beach. It's Kevin Schofield from Seattle City Council Insight. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Brian, I'm feeling a little queasy from the last week of council meetings too. But.
No doubt. A lot to take in here. Our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast, City Grind Espresso from the first floor of City Hall. They, of course, are closed during the pandemic, but we thank them for their support. And if you want this show to keep on rolling, we need your support on Patreon, folks. Very simple to do, just a couple of bucks a month. We do have a lot of patrons-only content for you. We can answer your questions on the show. What a deal for you. A shout-out to Fred, a new patron this past week. Thank you, sir. Thanks also to Converge Media for airing the video version of the podcast. All right, let's get going with right here, right now. Okay, so what's happening right now? Well, the budget battle between the mayor and city council very much still underway. The mayor giving her budget proposal this week for the 2021 budget after the council last week voted to override the mayor's veto of their 2020 budget rebalancing package. Kevin, before we look backwards, I guess, to what happened with that override vote, I want to look forward here. What are the top issues you are going to be keeping an eye on in this budget proposal from the mayor? I have to guess that police funding is at the top of your list there.
Police funding and navigation team
right.
Are big ones. The mayor has promised $100 million for investing in BIPOC communities.
Yeah,
and so how that money shows up, how it gets distributed, kind of the whole mechanism behind that is going to be an interesting thing. Also, where she finds it. Right?
Yeah.
Is it coming from cuts from other things? Is it new revenue? And where is she? The revenue outlook for next year is supposed to be really, really bad. That's what the mayor and the city budget office have been saying consistently. So, some people are wondering, is she going to propose a new flat income tax?
Yeah, right.
Which the courts in last year have said that that they can do now.
Yeah.
Not a progressive one, but a flat one. So at a time when really the budget is very, very tight, she's promised $100 million in new spending on this. And we're just going to have to see where it comes from.
Well, let's keep going down this path, and I want to come back to the navigation team here. This whole idea of where you get the money from is one thing for this $100 million into BIPOC communities. But then again, who is serving on this committee? I thought it was a very interesting piece in the Seattle Times about this. A number of black leaders in Seattle, like Sean Good from Choose 180, which works with young people in South Seattle and throughout the area. They're saying, I don't want to be a part of this. The cake is already baked. I think the mayor is looking for people to be on her side here. She's talking about participatory budgeting, but I don't know if everybody sees it that way, at least in the black and brown community.
This is another place where we have two factions in City Hall.
Yeah.
Right? We have the mayor trying to build partnerships with certain representatives in the black community.
Right.
And we have the city council trying to build relationships with other representatives from the black community. Right.
Yeah.
So the city council is going to have probably their own proposal or a riff on the mayor's proposal for how to do participatory budgeting that may involve a completely different set of people. Right.
Right.
And it's certainly not good that the council and the mayor are asking people to choose sides. Right. That's not good. And, I think we would all like them to be able to come together with a single proposal.
Right.
And maybe they'll negotiate that over the next 2 months as they go through this budget process. Well, that's another thing I'll be watching for, to see if that comes out as something coherent at the end. Because if they're running two separate parallel processes, it's going to be really bad.
Yeah. Who is City Hall talking to? That's been a constant refrain over the past several months of protest. Let's dive a little bit further into that navigation team issue here. So, of course, this is the group that interacts with homeless people in Seattle. The council voted to disband this, basically. The mayor is saying there's no plan to replace that function in the city. This feels like another situation, Kevin, where I'm looking at that 2020 budget. The council can certainly ask the mayor to move spending from the NAV team to outreach groups like REACH, which is what they've done with their veto override vote, but the mayor doesn't have to spend the money that way. Let's talk about the NAV team and the difference of opinions there, please.
Well, yes and no. You know, the city council can pass provisos that say you can't spend this money this way.
Yeah.
You know, for them to pass broad ones, there's you know, the navigation team, this named entity,
yes,
right? And the council can defund, you know, their current budget and put in some provisos in place saying that, you know, you can't keep the navigation team going by, you know, pulling money from other sources.
right.
To some extent they can do that, but there's just sort of a functional level of, you know, the functions that the navigation team is doing right now.
Yes.
Right. You know, the mayor can find money in other places and do those functions in other places. In fact, you know, arguably she's going to have to do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, this is kind of the crazy part about this. There are rumors going around, and I've heard these too, and to some level have substantiated them, that there are actually city council members calling up the mayor's office asking to have homeless encampments removed from specific places in their districts.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is what the navigation team is supposed to do, right?
Right.
They're not asking the navigation team to do this because politically they can't do that. They're defunding the navigation team right now.
Right.
But in private, some of these homeless encampments that are really, really problematic, they're still trying to do it, right? So will they, you know, find some uneasy balance in there between the city council and the mayor's office? Again, we'll have to see.
Yeah, and I know Erica Barnett was reporting on this too. She's gotten some word at least about what the mayor's considering with the navigation team as we try to forecast a little bit here. She's talking about perhaps a smaller group that is focused a little bit more on outreach and engagement rather than the encampment removal piece. But I think that's the sticking point, Kevin. There is still going to be sometimes, somehow, as much as nobody really likes it, there has to be an issue where, or there has to be a situation where encampments need to be removed, and who's going to do that? I just don't think the city has that figured out yet.
Right, and there's really two sticking points around this. One is, is it possible for people whose job is outreach to be effective in doing that if they're associated with the team whose job is to remove encampments?
Yeah,
right. That's why Reach pulled out of providing that service.
Right.
And then the second part is, what is the role of police officers, right, in the whole process of removing encampments, right? And is their very presence, who, you know, by some level is actually required to protect the safety of the people, to some level doing outreach, but definitely doing encampment removal.
Right.
You know, they're Seattle Fire Department employees, like even when, you know, like there's you know, somebody in crisis or a fire, you know, there are frequently fires at
these
homeless encampments. And, you know, the fire department often will not go into those scenes until they know that it's been secured by the police department. Right. So what exactly is the role of the police department in dealing with homeless encampments? That is really a big sticking point.
Right. Well, a lot to figure out, I know, for the mayor there and the city council as they work through that specific part of the budget there with police funding here. But I wanted to ask you, Kevin, as we move on to some of the other things that are on the docket for the city this week, looking at the TNC minimum wage issue here, of course, the transportation network companies, the council are going to work on passing this week, this minimum wage bill for transportation network company drivers, Uber and Lyft, as we know. Kevin, we spoke on this last week, and there have been a few tweaks to this final bill. The per mile rate is up a little bit, the minimum compensation now $5 per trip. I wanted to get, though, into the weeds a little bit about helping the part-time drivers out here, which it appears the council tried to address in tweaking this bill. Try to break down what happened, please.
Yeah, okay, so deep into the weeds here.
Yeah.
So the people that designed the minimum wage standard here are the same people that designed the one for New York City. And the New York City one, you know, was basically designed in a way that it really favors full-time drivers over part-time drivers, which raises all sorts of questions about, you know, should City Hall be choosing between full-time drivers and part-time drivers, right? Who, you know, are doing this for slightly different reasons, but for, you know, arguably both of them to make ends meet, right?
Yep.
Do we think, you know, that this is really a full-time job for folks?
Sure.
Is it, you know, is it a way for people to drive part-time as maybe a second gig to you know, help them, you know, close their budget,
help them get by? Yeah. All part of the gig economy. You bet.
So the New York City model does this thing called the utilization rate.
Right.
That basically says, the question is, you know, do Uber and Lyft have to pay drivers for the time they're what's called P1 time, the time they're sitting around waiting
to be dispatched,
right? And what's called P2 time, which is the time they're actually driving to go pick up somebody.
Right.
Today they just pay them.
P3 is when they actually have passengers with them. Keep going. Yeah.
Today, the vast majority of the payment is for just P3, a little bit for P2 if it takes a long time to get to a particular place, right? So, but no P1 time is paid at all, right? And so what New York City has said and Seattle City Hall, both the mayor and city council have said is, we actually think we should be paying people for P1 and P2. The New York City model does this thing to utilization rate, which says, okay, we are going to, base the rate on P3, but it's based on, data that we've collected that says drivers spend, this percentage of their time in P1 and P2. And so we're basically going to multiply the P3 rate to make it bigger to accommodate the time that we actually want, know that drivers spend in P1 and P2.
Yeah.
And in New York City, they adjust that on a monthly basis. So they're constantly collecting data, they're constantly adjusting it. And so, the inevitable outcome of this is it's a strong incentive for Uber and Lyft to minimize the amount of time that drivers spend in P1 and P2.
Right.
And really the only lever they have to pull to do that is to reduce the number of drivers that
That's
they have,
right. Yep.
Right. And that way the drivers are busier and they're spending less time sitting around.
Yep.
Because there are just fewer drivers competing for dispatches.
Yes.
And that inevitably favors the full-time drivers,
of course,
the part-time drivers.
Yep.
Right? So City Hall here in Seattle, the mayor proposed basically the same deal as New York City, except the utilization rate could only be updated annually instead of monthly.
Right.
And there was still a big stink raised about that, and and I've pointed out that to folks in City Hall that really practically that's not going to change the outcome of this.
Right.
And Uber and Lyft have both said out loud, that's true. I mean, they will have no, alternative but to do this. What the city council did in an amendment before they passed this out of committee last week was they said no changes in utilization rate. So they've done initial calculation, no changes in utilization rate for the first 3 years.
3 years, right.
And then, it has to be, when they recalculate the utilization rate, they have to do it based upon a full 12 months of data.
Right.
So, at least for the next 3 years, there was no incentive for Uber and Lyft really to make a big change there, because it's not, and try to sort of restrict it to just full-time drivers, or just, put a cap on the number of drivers, because it's not going to change the amount that they pay to anybody. Right. The utilization rate is fixed for the next 3 years.
For everybody. Yeah. So that's going to be and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in court when Uber and Lyft try to bring this up again. But thank you for that breakdown, Kevin, because there's a lot still ahead for TNC drivers here. Let's shift up to Now Hear This. So in this segment of the show, we usually listen to some sound bites from local elected leaders about a certain topic. But this time, I'm going to have everybody listen in to some of the protest activity in Seattle that happened last week following the court decision not to prosecute officers for Breonna Taylor's death. This is from Converge Media. Listen in.
We could probably expect some flashbangs coming out. There he goes. There he goes. They're going to push down. They're going to push. There it is. I told you, you get the flashbang. I told you they were coming. You all right?
All right, so you heard the flashbangs going. Omari Salisbury shot the footage. He's doing okay. He's hanging in there. He's done a lot of this work on the front lines here. Kevin, this is a protest that started near 11th and Pine, the western edge of the CHOP, if you remember that. 13 arrests from this, some fires lit, plenty of vandalism, broken windows happening, an officer hitting the back of the helmet with a baseball bat. There was a piece of video I didn't show, though. It has a police officer rolling over the head on a bicycle. He's rolling over the head of a protester who is lying in the street. That officer now on paid leave. It doesn't sound like that protester was badly hurt, but just another difficult image to see, Kevin. And with these protests here, tear gas used again, your thoughts on this most recent clash between police and protesters? What does it tell you?
I think I have a couple of things. One of the well, first of all, let's just say that as far as I can tell from the video, there's absolutely no reason why the police officer should have rolled over the protester with his bike. That just seems completely, utterly egregious.
Yeah.
And, barring, some video footage that shows that that wasn't an accurate view of what happened, I hope they throw the book at him, because, it's just outrageous and egregious.
Yeah.
So then one of the issues that's really come up a lot as City Hall and OPA and the Office of the Inspector General for Public Safety and the courts have been discussing, SPD's policies for crowd control and crowd control weapons, has been this issue of what do you do about a case where you've got a small number of violent individuals who've embedded themselves in a larger peaceful crowd of
protest,
protesters, right? And I think what we've seen, particularly over the last month, is SPD really changed their tactics around this, right? Where now there are many more incidents where they're actively going into crowds to try to arrest people.
Yes, right.
And it's certainly having a disruptive effect upon those crowds of peaceful protesters. But it seems to be fewer instances, not no instances, but fewer instances where they're trying to basically just disperse an entire crowd.
Right.
So we've seen, and the SPD hasn't announced that this is their new policy for how to do this. But it seems at some level they're trying to take this feedback that they've heard from the OPA, from OIG, from the courts, and say, okay, let's at least try some things and see if we can, do something in this really awkward situation where we don't have to do this big dispersal of a crowd. We don't have to get into using pepper spray or blast balls or any of those things.
Right.
We just, more surgically go in and try to pull out the people that are really doing violent acts.
Right. And I bring this up, too, because Merrick Bobb, the former federal monitor who was overseeing the consent decree process involved with the SPD, he wrote a memo to the mayor last week about this, kind of his last sign-off, I guess you'd say. He's talking about trying to create some sort of new tactical unit, which would come up with some new strategies when it comes to dealing with crowds or whatever else. He's really saying that this whole process needs a complete overhaul. And I wonder what you make of that, Kevin. What is needed? And I know there's the big question that the police and the city are wrestling with right now, but what does that overhaul look like? Does anyone have an idea?
No, and again, these are all issues that have come up, and there is broad agreement that, while SPD has a crowd control policy and it has, use of force policies that include, what weapons and tools they use in crowd control situations, there are some major holes in that.
And Merrick Bobb saying, they didn't look like they had a plan for the better part of the summer, is what he said.
There's lack of strategic planning up front. There's lack of, actually putting together, a plan by an incident commander and saying, okay, here is how we're going to handle the protest tonight. But then beyond that, there's just simply issues of, there's no policy for how SPD handles protests about the police. Right, which is really a special situation. And it's an important one, right? And that's what all this summer has been about. And, there've been protests about that in the past before. But in particular, for the last 3 months, what we've seen is 4 months now, night after night after night of protests about the police.
Specific on
that. And they have no instruction manual, internal instruction manual for how to deal with, protests where the people who are being protested, or the topic that's being protested is them. Right. And their actions are, if every time they take an action at one of those protests, they almost inevitably escalate the situation. Right.
So I know the federal court's working on this right now. I know Black Lives Matter, of course, with the lawsuit going on. You've got a number of merchants up on Capitol Hill concerned about it, too, filing their own lawsuits here. I'm not sure what's going to be adjudicated here, Kevin, but that feels like the final line here. Somewhere in court this year, or hopefully soon, we'll hear something on this and get some better guidelines. Do you have that feel, or what do you think?
I do, because clearly what's happening right now is not working. I think Judge Robart is going to, inevitably end up with a crowd control policy, a new one in front of him. Whether that comes out of, SPD or some, blue ribbon committee that looks at this. I think it's hard to say. And, quite frankly, I think the outcome of the November elections will depend on that, right?
That's
because
a great point too.
This DOJ has not pushed hard on major changes to SPD, right? But if it flips to a Biden administration, I think we'll go back to the kind of more aggressive policies that we saw under the Obama administration, which led to the SPD consent decree in the first place in 2012.
Right. Wow, that's a great observation there, Kevin. I wanted to make sure we brought up another issue with the SPD. the police department has withdrawn its subpoena for media footage. This is a case we've been following for a little while here. This from local media companies getting their footage from some protests from May 30th where a man stole a firearm from a police vehicle here. So as it turns out, cops have made an arrest in this case, happened in early September here, so they don't need the footage. Is that it then behind this case, Kevin? This was a very interesting one that I know you tackled in SCC Insight.
Yeah, they arrested the suspect they believe was the one who actually, took the guns out of the police car.
Yeah.
They had already, previously recovered one of the guns,
but not all of them. Right.
There was one still outstanding.
Yeah.
What they found out at this point, though, is that it looks like the suspect, has actually sold the other gun to somebody else.
Right.
So at this point, not only have they arrested him, but they don't believe that the footage will, at this point, help them in any way to recover the gun.
Right, because it would take so long for that to get sussed out.
And that was the basis of their argument for the subpoena, saying like, we need, it was less about arresting the guy.
Yes.
It was much more about, we need to recover this gun.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that argument is completely undermined. So so the city and SPD have basically, petitioned the court to just dismiss it as moot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I think it's still outstanding as to whether, the plaintiffs, the media companies say, no. We want this to live on so that we can
set
get
some sort of precedent.
a definitive ruling on this from the courts. But the courts are only allowed to adjudicate what's, called live controversies.
Yes.
Right. And so this one is really, moot at this point.
Yeah.
And, there's wiggle room if it was something where SPD could immediately could decide next week, no, we actually want to reinstitute the subpoena again. In this case, it's really unlikely that they're going to do that. So it's very unlikely that the court would do anything other than just dismiss it as moot.
Right. Such an interesting sidebar story to what's been going on with these protests over the last few months. All right, let's move on to what's next. All right, Kevin, let's get an update on the dueling recall efforts, one facing Councilmember Sawant, the other facing Mayor Jenny Durkan. Let's tackle the mayor first here. This one charge still alive in the courts. The mayor failed to have better crowd control policies in place during the George Floyd protest. That's on its way to the Supreme Court October 8th. What's next with this one, Kevin?
Yeah, so it's at the Supreme Court. All the legal briefs on both sides have been filed now, and the state Supreme Court has said that they do a conference with all 9 justices once a month. Next one is October 8th. They've said they're going to discuss it then. They may or may not decide on it at that point, but they probably will, because the state law says that this has to be basically their highest priority when a recall petition comes up. They're supposed to drop almost everything else and focus on this. So they'll probably turn that around quickly. It may not be exactly on the 8th. They may need a day or two to draft the finding, but we'll probably see an answer on this pretty quickly after that. The petitioners, you mentioned that there's one live charge right now.
Yes.
Everything else, all the rest of them got dismissed. The petitioners are trying to get 2 more of them revived.
Okay.
And Mayor Durkan and her attorneys are trying to get the one remaining one dismissed as well. So it could end up at 0, could end up at 3, could end up anywhere in between that.
We will see where it goes. I know former Supreme Court Justice Bobby Bridge, part of a Times op-ed, saying this charge against Durkan is highly legally defective. So we'll definitely see what happens there.
There's strong legal arguments that would argue against it, and mostly it's around the fact that it's pretty clear in the city charter and city law that this is what they're accusing her of is something that she could or could not do at her discretion. Right.
A police chief issue.
And discretionary acts, or not, well, in this case specifically, not doing something that was under her discretion is generally not considered to be a basis for recall.
Got it. And just trying to keep score at home here, Councilmember Sawant, there are 4 charges certified with her recall petition. What's the status of this case, Kevin?
Right. So a couple weeks back, the judge certified the 4 charges, and then he said the attorneys for Councilmember Sawant asked for a couple more days to, propose some changes to language, because the court not only certifies the charges, but then potentially rewrites what they call the ballot synopsis, what would appear on the petitions as they go around trying to get signatures, but then also what would eventually end up on the ballot if it does go in front of voters.
Yeah.
And Sawant's lawyers made several suggestions for changes, and in particular what they wanted to do is they wanted to have the language parallel more the language in the ballot synopsis for Mayor Durkan. And the one for Mayor Durkan talks a little bit more explicitly about how the charges are alleged, and the one that had been drafted for Councilmember Sawant did not.
Did
so
not.
It sounded a little more definitive, like
language was different.
These things are true. So the judge did in fact do that. He rewrote it a little bit just to call it these are alleged charges. Sawant's attorneys asked for some other charges to kind of soften some of the language around it, so it didn't look quite so accusatory.
Yeah.
And mostly they didn't get their way on that.
All right. Thank you for breaking that down, Kevin. We want to make sure that we keep people updated on what's happening with these recall efforts facing Councilmember Sawant and Mayor Durkan. All right, so we always like to wrap things up. We've got to wrap things up here. We wrap up the Coffee Break podcast with a treat, drawing on Kevin's vast knowledge of all things baking. Today, it's good old pumpkin bread. My daughters baked some up here. Kevin, it's October. Definitely, tis the season here. What is the secret to getting the nice moist bread here? Of course, I got to show the treat to Kevin. This is always sugar glaze. They love that sugar glaze. But what's the secret to getting the nice moist bread, not a dense brick of pumpkin? There's something to this here.
Well, yeah, so.
Oh yeah, that's good stuff.
The pumpkin bread, things like this, they don't use yeast in them, right? It's baking powder or basic baking soda, and a lot of people wonder, like, what's the difference between baking powder and baking soda? And
oh boy,
if you've ever,
that's a whole nother show, Kevin. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's actually pretty simple. So, did you ever do like the science for volcano?
Oh yeah.
So
volcano,
vinegar and baking soda, right? It's
Yep.
an acid. It's acid and a base.
Yep.
Right. And so baking soda is the base. Right, and that baking powder is baking soda plus a powder form of an acid.
Right.
So that when you basically mix baking powder into water, then it starts bubbling. It creates a whole bunch of carbon dioxide, which is the gas that will give this thing lift. Right. So you have to get the balance of base and acid right to get that right. So you see, like, some recipes call for baking soda, some call because there are other things like maybe orange juice or some other form of acid in the recipe that's going to be balancing out the base in the baking soda. And some don't have that, and you have to use baking powder, and you have to get the amount right to generate enough gas or enough lift. So there's a bunch of chemistry in there that goes and figures out, like, what really is the right balance of these things. And some recipes call for both.
Right. And don't overmix it too. I know I've heard that too. So you don't get too much reaction going on in there. Is that a part of it?
There's a little bit of a timing thing, right? Because as soon as you mix in the water in with the baking powder, it's going to start creating that gas, right? So you can't wait too long after you mix that in. It's not like you go do a rise first and then you bake it. You put it in and then you bake it right away. Pretty much.
This is why people tune in, Kevin. They want to know about politics.
They
want to know about chemistry. Right? They want to know about chemistry. We want to know about
baking powder. Yeah, well, we really want to know what's the difference between baking soda and baking powder.
This is the important stuff. Kevin, as always, sir, I appreciate you being on the podcast with me.
Oh, but I got baking.
Would you? Oh, sorry, I didn't know you brought some along. What do you got, dude?
I made breakfast muffins. My favorite breakfast.
Yes. What's in the mix there? What is this?
There's so much in this. This is. Whole wheat flour, oat bran. There's some grated up carrots and apple and almonds and a little bit of coconut in there.
A cornucopia, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you will. Wow, what's the secret to keeping that one together? There's a lot of ingredients in there. Patience.
Yeah, what's a secret? I don't know what the secret is. It's a very thick batter.
Mm-hmm,
it's a very thick batter, and it's you bake it in paper cups, and then if this is the kind of thing where if you baked it flat, it would just kind of spread out. Right?
Yes,
but you bake it in in a cupcake tray so that it's kind of forced to go up.
There we go.
It doesn't actually rise a lot.
Okay. Okay. You gotta know your batter. Hey, batter. Got to know your batter there, Kevin. All right, we've covered what we needed to cover. We got through the muffins. We got through the pumpkin bread here. We got through most of the things happening at City Hall. I know we will be back next week with a lot more going on the budget. Thank you once again, sir, for joining me.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. If you are wanting to know what's happening in local politics here, give us a listen on Seattle News, Views, and Brews and find out what's brewing. Subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. Please support us on Patreon if you like what you're hearing. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you soon. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.